The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, written by George Lipsitz, 1998, lesson prepared by Tasha White. This article was inspired by the murder of Bill Moore that took place in 1963 as the postman attempted to deliver a letter to the Mississippi governor about the inequality that still existed based on race. In his letter, he said, "The white man cannot be truly free himself until all men have their rights." 70 miles into his quest, his body was found on the side of the road, shot in the head point blank. The sign he was wearing was found alongside him covered in blood. Although a member of the KKK was initially charged with the crime, the grand jury ultimately decided that no one would be charged with the murder of Bill Moore. The author discusses the impact that Moore's murder had on him and how it helped him see that he needed to reconsider what mattered to him and how he himself would stand up for racial inequality. He explains how even at a young age he was aware of white privilege and the impact it had on racial and economical segregation. During this time, the author realized that separate is never equal, and that the efforts of people like Moore need to be honored. Chapter 1 reminds me of Dean Spade's trickle-up social justice theory, in the way that the author tells us that Richard Wright explained that the Negro problem is not actually due to the fact that there are black people, but due to the manner in which white people conduct themselves. Lipsitz explains that racism has always been around in the U.S., but has changed over time, taking on different forms and serving different social purposes in each time period. He goes on to give several examples of how, from the beginning, our country has been based on the possessive investment in whiteness, with the misuse of Native Americans as their land was taken and they were forced into slavery and continued to the African slave trade and Asian low-wage labor. Slavery did not begin in America. However, white Americans based their slave system solely on race. Racism has adjusted its focal point depending on the current needs at that time to support white needs. Although some steps have been taken forward in the fight against racism, a steady upward progression towards the extinction of racism has not occurred. The New Deal era and the Federal Housing Act of 1934 both discriminated against minorities and people of color, putting an even larger wedge between the privileges given to white people and at the same time denied to people of color. Even though the FHA and the Veterans Administration gave more than $120 billion towards housing from 1934 until 1962, 98% of this money went to white families, while the remainder was divided among non-white families. The urban renewal programs of the 70s created an even larger gap between the affordability and possibility of people of color purchasing their own homes, as 90% of the housing that had been demolished was never rebuilt as housing complexes and instead used for commercial purposes. People moved out of these areas, lessening a strong sense of advocacy for these low-income, minority-rich neighborhoods, allowing for the placement of prisons, dumps, and other less-than-ideal living environments, forcing even more people to leave. A U.S. Commission on Civil Rights investigation uncovered the fact that FHA had made deals with Blockbusters to support low-income white families from moving out of the city and then enlisted ruthless realtors to sell substandard housing to minorities with the hopes of owning their own homes. The 1991 movie Boys in the Hood explains this concept as gentrification. Webster's online dictionary defines this as the process of renewal and rebuilding accompanying the influx of middle-class or affluent people into deteriorating areas that often displaces poorer residents. In 1990, a study by the National Institute on Drug Abuse showed that even though 77% of drug users in the U.S. are white and only 15% are Black Americans are 4 times more likely to be arrested. This discrimination continues with the sentencing of these crimes, as people of color tend to get longer, harsher sentences, while white people historically get abbreviated jail time if having to face any time at all. The author explains how the discrimination cycle continues as whites, having years of equity built upon or passed on to them, are able to take advantage of the housing market, and non-whites continue to struggle to be approved for loans due to years of past discrimination and refusal, resulting in a lack of net worth to borrow against. As whites are able to support their children by being granted college, car, and home loans, non-whites are unable to get approved and help their children succeed in the same manner. The 1990 National Opinion Research Report showed how the public felt about the reasons for Black people struggling. These sentiments continue to be expressed as the younger generation claims they had nothing to do with slavery or segregation, and that people of color are still holding on to these past grievances. Lipsitz reminds us that the social injustice in this case is beyond slavery and is truly a cycle that has held people of color back for decades. Lipsitz wraps up his article by explaining that failure to acknowledge our society's possessive investment in whiteness prevents us from facing the present openly and honestly. He suggests that in order for us to make a real change, we need to accept responsibility for contributing to this cycle by continuing to thrive on the privileges granted to us simply because we were born white. By continuing to ignore the reality of these privileges, we are ultimately part of the problem. His explanation not only reminds me of McIntosh's White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack article, but also of the Lone Wolf piece about the Las Vegas massacre and the fact that a former Nobel Peace Prize winner is standing idly by as her country moves closer to genocide. These articles all explain that standing by and doing nothing is the same as being part of the problem. In other words, by being passive bystanders, we are actively contributing to this cycle of inequality. The possessive investment in whiteness began when our country began. These middle school students in Massachusetts have started a movement towards changing the name of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day due to the fact that Columbus was wrongly viewed as a hero, when in fact he paved the way for race-based slavery and mistreatment of people due to their ethnic identity. It is refreshing to know that there are youth out there, like the author of this book, who even at a young age acknowledge these injustices and are trying to make a change in moving towards a brighter future. When asked if they thought changing the name would mean ignoring the past, they explained that by celebrating this day, they were not ignoring the past, but giving people the opportunity to learn about the reality of the time and celebrating our true history. In this way, they are breaking the cycle of the possessive investment in whiteness. Question 1. What are some ways we can reinvest in human resources, as Lipsitz suggests? Question 2. If this article were written today, do you think the same findings would hold true? In essence, is the possessive investment in whiteness better, worse, or the same as it was almost 20 years ago when this article was written?